The whiskey slid down his throat like liquid fire, but it could not burn away the ghosts that lived in Elias Boone's chest. They came for him every night, faces of children he couldn't save, women crying beneath the crack of gunfire, the smell of smoke rising from a village that once sang under the stars. He used to think time would wash the stains from his soul. 10 years had passed, and the stains had only darkened. He sat alone in the corner of the Broken Spurs saloon, the lantern light catching the tired lines on his weathered face. His fingers, scarred and steady, traced the rim of the glass the way a blind man might follow the edges of an old memory. Outside, the wind pushed against the cracked windows, carrying the lonely voice of the desert. There was peace in that sound, but also punishment. A whisper that reminded him he had once ridden with men who called murder duty. Elias had been a captain once, a leader of the blue coats who rode into Apache country under flags that claimed to bring order. He had followed orders until one day he saw what order meant: women and children lying still under a sky that looked away. The name of that place, Sand Creek, had become the wound he never stopped bleeding. He turned in his commission the next day and never looked back. But the past had a way of finding men like him, no matter how far they rode. The saloon door swung open, spilling moonlight and dust across the floor. A man stepped in, boots clicking, spurs whispering like snakes in tall grass. His laughter carried the cruelty of someone who had seen too much killing and found it easy to remember. "Captain Boone," he drawled, "didn't think ghosts could still drink." Elias didn't turn. He didn't need to. He knew the voice. Sergeant Reynolds, one of the soldiers who had survived the same horrors he had abandoned. The kind of man who had never questioned what they did, who still called it victory. "Not a captain anymore," Elias murmured, his tone soft but heavy, like a blade half-drawn. Reynolds leaned against the bar beside him. "Still chasing dead men, I hear. You after that professor fella, Holloway. Heard there's $500 on his head." Elias didn't answer. Money had nothing to do with it. Holloway's wanted poster lay folded in his pocket, its paper worn from being read too many times. A scholar turned killer, or maybe something stranger. Word was, the man had disappeared into Apache lands with a child. That was what drew Elias. Not the crime, but the child. Because he remembered another child, dark eyes shining through smoke, staring at him in silence as he stood frozen with a rifle in his hand, too late to stop the massacre. He had spent a decade trying to forget those eyes. Maybe now he could make peace by saving one pair that still lived. Reynolds smirked when Elias finally rose from his seat. "You heading out again into the wild? Thought you'd learned there's no saving savages." Elias turned to face him then. The lamplight caught the grey in his beard and the sadness in his eyes, a sadness that had learned to wear armor. "No," he said quietly, "but maybe there's saving left for me." The saloon hushed. For a long moment, even the piano stuttered into silence. Then Reynolds laughed, but it sounded thinner now. "You still think redemption's waiting out there?" Elias didn't reply. He dropped a coin on the counter and walked out into the night, his boots stirring dust that shimmered like silver beneath the moon. The desert opened before him like an endless confession. The stars burned white against a black sky, sharp and clear as judgment. He saddled his horse, a scarred mustang named Dust, and fastened his rifle to the saddle. his breath fogged in the cool air, each exhale a prayer without words. Somewhere beyond those mountains, Frank Holloway rode with a stolen child, and Elias could not rest until he found them. He rode until the lanterns of Santa Fe were swallowed by distance. The road turned to sand, the sky deepened to indigo, and silence fell. That sacred, dangerous silence of the desert where every heartbeat feels like a memory. His mind drifted to the faces he had lost, to the ghosts who rode behind him. Sometimes he imagined them whispering forgiveness. Other nights he heard them accuse him, but tonight they only listened. By dawn, the world had turned to gold. The first light poured over red cliffs and sleeping cacti, bathing everything in a holy glow. Elias reined in his horse atop a ridge and stared eastward. In that quiet hour, the desert looked almost kind. It was a lie he chose to believe for one breath longer. Down below, he saw the tracks, fresh, shallow, a set of boot prints beside the smaller prints of a child. He dismounted, crouched, and touched the earth. The prints led toward the ruins of an old mission long abandoned to sand and silence. It was said the Apaches called it a cursed place, where prayers once rose but no longer found their way to heaven. He followed the trail. Inside the mission walls, shadows clung to the stones like memories. The scent of ashes still lingered. Near a broken altar, he found the remains of a campfire, still warm. Whoever had been here was close. He raised his rifle, every sense sharpening. A whisper came from behind a fallen beam. It wasn't English, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear mixed with defiance. Elias lowered his rifle slowly, hands open. "It's all right," he said softly. "I won't hurt you." The girl who stepped out could not have been more than 13. Her hair was black as raven feathers, her eyes dark as wet stone. She wore torn Apache garments and a small stone talisman around her neck. There was something in her gaze that made Elias's heart stop. That same unblinking sorrow he had seen once before in a burning village long ago. He tried Spanish. "No tengo arma." She stared. "I'm looking for a man. Frank Holloway." He unfolded the wanted poster. The girl glanced, then shook her head, murmuring something in her tongue. Then, faintly, in broken Spanish, "Bad men. East." She pointed with a trembling hand. "They have my sister." Elias felt a chill despite the heat. "Your sister?" The girl nodded, tears glinting in her lashes. Before he could ask more, distant hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. 5 riders, dust trailing behind them like ghosts. Instinct took over. "Hide," he whispered. The girl darted into the shadows as Elias pressed himself against the stone wall. The riders stopped outside the ruins, their leader dismounted, a man with a scar across his cheek. "Holloway!" he shouted. "Raymond Locke wants his answers. Come out now, Locke!" The name burned in Elias's mind. He had heard it whispered in saloons, a ruthless land baron who bought souls as easily as he bought silver mines. What could he want with a child? When no one answered, the men fanned out, rifles raised. Elias moved silently along the inner wall, his rifle ready. The first man who entered saw only a flicker of motion before a single shot dropped him. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the stone. Bullets sparked against walls. Dust filled the air. Elias fired twice more, quick, precise, until only 2 of them remained. The survivors retreated behind a low wall, shouting to one another, "Whoever you are, you're dead, mister. Locke doesn't forgive." Elias didn't answer. Silence fell again, broken only by the girl's whisper behind him, a trembling prayer in Apache. Then something changed. The wind rose, whirling dust into spirals. The sky darkened, though no cloud had been there moments before. The girl stepped into the open, her eyes closed, her hands raised. The storm came alive around them, a living thing made of sand and thunder. The riders screamed as the desert swallowed them whole. When the wind finally died, nothing remained but the quiet pulse of the earth and the stunned beating of Elias's heart. The girl opened her eyes and looked at him. "Help me," she said in English, so soft it barely existed. Elias stood frozen, caught between awe and fear, between disbelief and the strange warmth blooming in his chest. That one fragile plea cracked something inside him, the shell that years of guilt had built around his soul. He nodded slowly. "I'll help you." The promise felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried, yet lighter than any burden he'd borne. He lifted her onto his horse, felt the small weight of her trust settle against him, and turned toward the rising sun. As they rode into the horizon, Elias didn't know that this journey, born of guilt, would lead him to something far greater than redemption. It would lead him to love, to faith, and to the miracle of forgiveness. The desert wind trailed behind them, whispering like an old hymn, not of war this time, but of healing. And somewhere beyond that golden light, destiny waited, watching, listening, waiting for hearts once broken by history to find their way home again. If this story touched a quiet corner of your heart, if it brought warmth to a place that felt cold, take a moment to share that light. Leave your thoughts, your voice, your kindness below. Like the story if it stirred something gentle in you, and subscribe to walk this journey with us, one chapter at a time. Your presence means more than words. Every spark of support keeps these tales of redemption, love, and healing alive for hearts still searching for hope beneath the same endless sky. The morning sun spilled across the desert like molten gold, painting the horizon in shades of amber and rose. Elias rode in silence, his body swaying with the rhythm of the horse, the small girl clinging lightly in front of him. Her name was Kinalda. He had learned that much in the broken mixture of Spanish and gestures they shared. The sound of her name felt ancient, soft as the wind, yet filled with an unspoken strength. She hadn't cried once. Not when the gunfire had stopped. Not when the storm had swallowed men alive. Only her eyes spoke. Dark, endless, carrying something older than fear itself. They rode east, where the sun bled slowly into the canyons, and the air smelled faintly of sage and stone. The land was empty, but alive. 1,000 unseen voices breathing through the dust and the wind. To Elias, it felt as if the desert were watching them, testing them, deciding whether to grant them mercy or memory. Kinalda's small fingers rested on the saddle horn, and sometimes she hummed under her breath, low, trembling notes that blended with the sound of the wind. The melody reminded Elias of church hymns from long ago, before faith had turned to dust in his hands. Every time she hummed, the heaviness in his chest eased, as though the tune itself stitched together the torn edges of his heart. When the sun reached its height, they stopped beneath a lone mesquite tree. Elias poured water from his canteen, handed it to her first. She drank with careful sips, like someone raised to never waste anything given by heaven. He offered her a strip of dried meat. She took it, but broke it in half, and gave the larger piece back to him. There was grace even in her hunger. The silence between them was not empty. It had its own texture, the kind that softens rather than separates. For years, Elias had filled silence with whiskey, trying to drown the ghosts. Now, riding beside this strange, brave child, he began to feel something different. Peace, fragile and uncertain, but real. As the day stretched on, he began to speak, not because he expected her to understand, but because the words needed air. He told her of rivers far north that froze in winter, of meadows filled with wildflowers so thick they looked like spilled paint. He told her of a woman he once loved, her laughter, the way she braided her hair with wild mint, the way she vanished into smoke when war came. Kinalda didn't speak, only listened, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Somehow her silence healed him more than any prayer ever had. By dusk they reached a small canyon where water shimmered in the hollow of a stone basin. The place was quiet, except for the cry of distant coyotes and the whisper of wind moving through tall grass. Elias built a small fire, careful to keep it hidden between the rocks. Kinalda sat close, her eyes reflecting the flame. The orange light painted her face in a way that made her seem both child and something more, an echo of the land itself, fierce and eternal. She pulled the talisman from around her neck, a polished stone with markings carved deep into its surface. She placed it in her small palm, studying it as if listening to a secret. When she finally looked up, she said softly, "Sister." Then she pointed east. Bad men. Elias understood. The sister was still out there, and the men, Reynolds or worse, were heading that way. He nodded slowly. "We'll find her." Kinalda's eyes lingered on him, searching, questioning the promise. In that gaze, Elias felt both judgment and trust. It was as though she could see everything he'd ever done, every ghost that lived beneath his skin, and still she handed him faith as if it were something simple and natural. That silent forgiveness pierced deeper than any bullet. As the fire burned lower, Elias found himself watching the stars. The desert sky unfolded like a cathedral ceiling made of light. Every constellation seemed sharper, closer, as if God had pressed his hand over this land to remind it of its holiness. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, sleep came softly, not dragged down by guilt, but lifted by a strange serenity that felt like a prayer answered without words. He dreamt of rain. Not the violent storms that broke bones and flooded rivers, but gentle rain, the kind that kissed the earth awake. In the dream, he saw Kinalda standing under that rain, her arms lifted, her hair streaming down her back like rivers of night. Behind her stood another girl, older, her sister perhaps, with eyes bright as firelight and a face that both accused and forgave him. When he woke, dawn had already broken, and the girl was sitting beside him, watching him with a faint, knowing smile. They rode again through valleys painted with morning mist. The air was cool, filled with the sweet scent of blooming yucca. Kinalda pointed toward a ridge where the ruins of a church rose like bones against the sky. Elias guided the horse closer. The building had been made of stone long ago, now cracked and faded by sun and wind. Inside, wildflowers had taken root where pews once stood. Kinalda knelt near what remained of the altar. She whispered something he couldn't hear, then pressed her talisman to the stone. Elias stood by the doorway, hat in hand, feeling an unfamiliar reverence fill him. This was her church now, her way of speaking to something greater, not with words, but with breath and silence. Watching her, Elias realized faith did not die in battlefields. It only changed its language. They found shelter that evening in a narrow ravine where the air smelled faintly of rain. Elias gathered brushwood and lit another small fire. He watched Kinalda trace patterns in the dirt with a stick, curves and symbols he didn't recognize. When she finished, she looked up at him and said quietly, "Safe." Then she smiled, the first time he had seen her do so. The warmth of it disarmed him completely. He had forgotten what a smile could do, how it could soften years of self-loathing with one simple grace. The girl ate her share of food, leaned back against the rock wall, and soon drifted into sleep. Elias sat beside her, listening to the wind sigh through the canyon, and thought of how strange redemption could look. Not in grand gestures, but in small mercies like this. A child breathing safely through the night. A man rediscovering his heart. The next day, clouds began to gather on the horizon, dark and heavy. Thunder murmured far away. Kinalda's expression changed. Alert, wary. "Storm," she said, touching the talisman. Elias looked up. The air had turned electric, shimmering with tension. He felt it too. Not just weather, but something else, something alive. They reached higher ground, a plateau marked by stone pillars and ancient carvings. From there, Elias saw smoke curling in the distance, the kind that came from a campfire, not a town. He turned to Kinalda. Her eyes widened. "Sister?" she whispered. Elias's heart quickened. He felt the pulse of purpose, sharp and alive. He checked his rifle, tightened the cinch on his saddle, and looked east. The wind shifted, carrying faint echoes of voices, distant and cruel. He could almost taste the danger ahead. Yet, beneath it, he felt a strange calm, the calm of a man who has finally found a reason to keep living. They descended the slope carefully, moving through dry brush and shadow. The sky deepened into bruised violet, thunder muttering like an old god's warning. When the first drops of rain began to fall, Kinalda raised her face to it, smiling softly, her lashes glistening with silver. She looked at peace, as though the storm were her kin. For Elias, that moment became something sacred. The sight of her standing there, unafraid of the sky's fury, made him believe that maybe even the wildest things in life, storms, grief, guilt, were not enemies to run from, but forces meant to cleanse. Healing did not always come gently. Sometimes it came roaring, tearing down walls so new roots could grow. When night fell, they camped beneath a natural arch carved by centuries of wind. The rain passed, leaving the world washed clean. The air smelled of wet stone and rebirth. Kinalda slept curled beside the fire, her talisman glowing faintly in the ember's light. Elias watched her, the rhythm of her breathing syncing with his own. For years he had lived like a man half dead, wandering from bounty to bounty, pretending redemption was just another debt to be paid. But this fragile trust, this strange companionship, felt like grace disguised as chance. He lay back, staring at the stars returning one by one. His thoughts drifted toward the east, to the unseen sister waiting beyond the hills. He imagined her, older, fierce, beautiful in that untamed way of desert women. Maybe she would hate him for what he once was. Maybe she would see only the uniform that had burned her people's homes. But maybe, if the ancestors were merciful, she would see what the child saw. A man still trying, still reaching for light through the ashes of his sins. The fire cracked softly, a rhythm like a heartbeat. The stars above shimmered, each one a promise of something unbroken. Elias closed his eyes, feeling peace like warm sand beneath his bones. Tomorrow they would ride again, toward danger, toward truth, toward the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. Far away, thunder whispered one last time before fading into the hush of the desert. It sounded almost like a benediction, a voice saying, "Keep going. You are not lost anymore." And beneath that vast, forgiving sky, Elias Boone finally slept without dreams. Only the quiet, healing hum of a soul beginning to mend, one heartbeat, one dawn at a time. The first light of dawn touched the canyon like a blessing, spilling over the jagged cliffs and brushing the sleeping earth in quiet gold. Elias woke before the girl, his senses sharpened by the desert stillness. The rain had washed the dust from everything, leaving the world smelling of stone, sage, and new beginnings. He sat for a moment, watching the thin ribbon of smoke rise from the dying fire. His breath felt different this morning, easier, cleaner, as if the air itself had forgiven him for surviving. Kinalda stirred beside him, blinking sleep from her eyes. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the sharpness of her fear. She looked smaller now, more child than spirit. Elias handed her a piece of dried bread. She accepted it with a small nod, the talisman at her throat catching the sun and glowing faintly like a heartbeat made of stone. They didn't speak. Words seemed unnecessary in that moment. The silence between them carried a strange peace, fragile but real. When they broke camp, the desert stretched before them in an ocean of red and gold, the horizon rippling with heat even in early morning. Elias mounted his horse and reached a hand down. Kinalda hesitated only a second before taking it. Her fingers were cool and small, but the touch steadied him in ways he couldn't explain. They rode east, following the path of the storm. The air felt lighter after the rain, and birds called from hidden cliffs, their cries echoing like fragments of lost songs. Elias listened, remembering a time when he believed music could heal the soul. Once, before the war, he had played a violin. He wondered what had become of it, or if someone had burned it like everything else that once belonged to the man he used to be. As they crossed a dry riverbed, he spotted movement on the far ridge. A column of smoke, thin but deliberate, a campfire. His pulse quickened. He halted the horse and lifted his spyglass. Through the shimmering distance, he saw 3 horses tethered near a cluster of rocks and men moving around a fire. He counted 2, then 3 more. and among them, a flash of color that didn't belong to the desert, a strip of crimson cloth, the kind Apache women wove into their shawls. Kinalda's breath caught. She pointed silently, her voice trembling when she whispered, "Sister." Elias lowered the glass slowly. He could see her now, a young woman, hands bound, head bowed beside the fire. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her posture radiated both exhaustion and pride. Even from this distance, Elias could feel the force of her presence. She looked nothing like a victim. She looked like a storm waiting for its moment to break. "Stay here," he told Kinalda, his tone gentle but firm. He dismounted and crouched beside her. "I'll bring her back." The girl's eyes searched his face as if weighing his soul. After a moment she nodded, pressing her talisman into his hand. "For safe," she said softly. The stone was warm. Elias closed his fingers around it, then turned toward the ridge. He moved like shadow between the rocks, every muscle remembering the silent discipline of soldiering. As he drew closer, he could hear voices. Rough laughter, the sound of boots scraping against stone, the clink of tin cups. At the center of the camp sat Reynolds, his old sergeant, the man who had once sneered at mercy like it was a weakness. The sight of him brought a flash of old rage, but Elias swallowed it down. There would be time for anger later. The woman sat a few feet away, her wrists tied with coarse rope. Even in the dim light she was striking, her hair braided with bits of bone and turquoise, her skin the color of copper burnished by the sun. Her eyes, when they lifted, met Elias's across the fire. They were fierce, defiant, and unbroken. Reynolds noticed the direction of her gaze and turned. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, standing. "Captain Boone, or should I say, Ghost of Sand Creek himself." Elias stepped from the shadows, rifle in hand, but lowered. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you." Reynolds grinned, his teeth yellow beneath the firelight. "You mean the girl? Found her trailing that crazy professor. Man's dead now. Seems this one knows something about what he was after." He nudged the bound woman with his boot. "Ain't that right, sweetheart?" She glared, but said nothing. Elias saw her flinch when Reynolds's hand brushed her shoulder, a gesture that carried more cruelty than touch. "Untie her," Elias said. Reynolds laughed. "You giving orders again, Captain? Thought you'd hung up that uniform." "I'm not asking twice." The silence stretched thin as a blade. Then Reynolds shrugged, mockingly casual. "You always did have a bleeding heart." His hand twitched toward his gun. Elias moved faster. The rifle's report split the air, echoing through the canyon. Reynolds staggered backward, eyes wide, a red bloom spreading across his chest. The camp exploded into chaos. Two men lunged for their weapons. Elias fired once more, dropped the first, rolled behind a rock as the second's bullet tore into the dirt beside him. The world narrowed into motion, instinct, survival. Another shot, another cry, then silence, broken only by the hiss of wind through the sage. When it was over, Elias's breathing came ragged, but his hands were steady. He approached the bound woman, knife drawn, not to harm but to free. Her gaze followed every move he made, sharp as the edge of the blade. He cut the rope. "You're safe now," he said quietly. Her voice, when it came, was low and filled with fire. "Safe? You killed them. There's no safety in blood." "I killed men who would have sold you," Elias answered, the words coming heavy. That's not the same kind of blood. She stood, rubbing her wrists, eyes never leaving him. You think the desert forgets who you are, white man? I'm not proud of who I was. Her expression shifted then, a flicker of surprise, maybe confusion. She studied him in the dim light, seeing the weathered lines, the sorrow that had carved itself deep into his face. You ride with the child, she said after a long pause. She's waiting for you. The woman's breath caught. For the first time, her armor cracked. Kinalda, she whispered, the name trembling like a prayer. Elias led her up the ridge, his steps careful. When Kinalda saw them, she ran forward, her cry echoing through the canyon like birds taking flight. The sisters embraced fiercely, their tears mingling with laughter. It was a sound Elias hadn't heard in years, pure, human, alive. He turned away, giving them their moment. The sky above them began to deepen into twilight, streaks of pink fading into indigo. When he looked back, the older sister, Nahoni, he would later learn her name, was watching him. Why did you help her? She asked simply. Because I didn't help the last one. Something in his voice made her eyes soften, though her stance remained guarded. You seek forgiveness from the dead? Maybe from the living, he said. They set up camp together that night near the canyon's edge. The firelight danced between them, painting her face in gold and shadow. Nahoni sat with Kinalda asleep against her shoulder, combing dust from the child's hair. There was strength in her silence, but also grief, a weight carried too long. Elias busied himself with the coffee pot, grateful for something to do with his hands. When he glanced up, Nahoni was watching him. Her eyes caught the fire's reflection, deep, dark, and full of questions. You were a soldier, she said finally. I was. Then you know how to destroy. He nodded. Too well. Her voice softened. Do you know how to heal? The question hung in the air between them. Elias stared into the fire, the flames flickering like memories. I'm learning, he said at last. The night stretched quiet around them. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, its voice both mournful and comforting. Nahoni covered Kinalda with a blanket and lay beside her, her hair spilling like ink across the sand. Elias turned his gaze to the stars, feeling the pull of something he couldn't yet name. He thought of her words, destroy and heal, and wondered if the two were ever truly separate. The wind sighed through the canyon, carrying a scent of rain, of renewal. For the first time, he didn't feel like running from it. Before sleep claimed him, he glanced once more at the sisters. Kinalda slept soundly, her small hand resting against her sister's. Nahoni's eyes were closed, but her lips moved faintly, a whisper in Apache, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse, maybe both. Elias smiled faintly into the darkness. Redemption, he thought, was not a destination, but a road that demanded walking, even barefoot, even bleeding. And tonight, for the first time in years, he felt his feet find that road again. Above them, the stars seemed brighter, as if the heavens themselves leaned closer to listen. Somewhere far away, thunder rolled softly like a promise of storms still to come, and healing that would arrive through them. The dawn that waited beyond that night would not bring peace yet, but it would bring direction. And beneath that sky of silver and flame, 3 travelers, a haunted man, a fierce woman, and a child who spoke to the wind, began to move toward a destiny that neither mercy nor vengeance could shape alone. The desert would remember their footsteps, as it always did. But for the first time, Elias Boone no longer feared what memory might bring. He only rode forward, heart opening slowly like the morning sun over the canyon. Gentle, painful, and impossibly alive. The sun rose over the canyon like a soft awakening, spilling warmth across the jagged earth. The night's chill retreated slowly, and the first light caught on the strands of Nahoni's dark hair as she crouched near the dying fire. Her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee Elias had prepared. The air smelled of smoke, sage, and new beginnings. Kinalda slept peacefully beside the embers, her small chest rising and falling like a tide at peace after a storm. Elias sat across from Nahoni, silent for a long time, his hat resting on his knee. He watched her face in the early light, the calm strength beneath her stillness, the quiet defiance that came from years of loss and survival. The scar along her wrist glowed faintly where the rope had burned, and he wondered how many such scars she carried unseen. "You don't trust me," he said finally. Her eyes lifted to meet his. "You've worn the uniform that broke my people. Trust is not given. It is earned." He nodded, not in defense, but in agreement. "Then I'll earn it." The desert around them was beginning to stir, the sound of a hawk circling, the faraway cry of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the cliffs. There was a sacred rhythm to it, and somehow, in that quiet harmony, their words felt less like argument and more like an old truth-finding voice. When Kinalda woke, the world had fully brightened. She smiled sleepily at her sister before turning to Elias with that shy, wordless gratitude he had come to recognize. He saddled the horse while the sisters gathered their few things, and together they set out north toward the shadow of the mountains, where Nahoni said the rest of her people might be hiding. They traveled in silence at first, each lost in thought. The land unfolded in waves of gold and crimson, cliffs rising like ancient cathedrals. To Elias, it felt like riding through the bones of the world, sacred, heavy, yet alive with quiet forgiveness. Nahoni guided them by instinct more than map, pausing sometimes to press her fingers to the ground, as if listening to something older than memory. Around midday, they stopped near a small stream. The sisters knelt to drink, their reflections shimmering beside each other, two faces shaped by the same blood, yet different in what they carried. Kinalda's face was open, luminous, still unscarred by the full cruelty of the world. Nahoni's was carved with strength, with the kind of grace born only through pain endured and survived. Elias watched them both, realizing how easily love could exist alongside sorrow. As they rested, Nahoni spoke without looking at him. "The man you killed yesterday, Reynolds." Elias's jaw tightened. "He left me no choice." "He left you one," she said softly. "You could have walked away." He met her gaze. "Would you have walked away if it were your sister?" Her silence was answer enough. She turned back to the stream, her reflection trembling in the ripples. "Blood calls to blood," she murmured. "But vengeance feeds nothing. It only drinks." Elias thought of the men he had hunted over the years, the bounties he'd collected under the pretense of justice. Every death had felt like payment toward some invisible debt. But the debt never shrank. It only grew heavier. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe I've been feeding the wrong ghosts." She glanced at him then, her eyes softer. "Maybe it's time to feed the living instead." The words settled in him like warm water, simple but profound. They reminded him of something he'd forgotten long ago, the way healing begins, not with forgetting the wound, but with choosing to tend it. That evening they made camp among the junipers. Elias built a small fire, careful to hide the glow from distant eyes. The sisters prepared a stew from roots and dried meat. When they ate, Kinalda hummed that same gentle tune she had sung before, the one that seemed to belong to the wind. Elias found himself closing his eyes, letting the melody wash through him. It was not joy, not yet, but something close to peace, a tender stillness that asked nothing but to be felt. After Kinalda had fallen asleep, Nehoni sat apart from the fire, her face turned toward the stars. Elias approached quietly, carrying his blanket, but she didn't turn. "When I was a child," she said, her voice low, "my mother told me the stars were the eyes of the ancestors. She said they never closed, not even when the world forgot them. When they shine brighter, it means they're watching closely. Tonight, they are bright." Elias looked up. The sky was ablaze with constellations, millions of scattered lights trembling in the cold air. "Maybe they're watching her," he said, nodding toward Kinalda. "Maybe," Nehoni whispered. "Or maybe they're watching you." He almost laughed. "I doubt the ancestors would bother with me." She turned then, her gaze steady. "They bother with anyone who carries both guilt and purpose. Those are the ones who can change what still lives." Her words felt like a hand pressed to his chest, steadying his heartbeat. He wanted to thank her, but the language of gratitude felt too small. Instead, he sat beside her in silence. For a long while they said nothing, only listened to the night breathe. When she finally spoke again, her voice had softened. "The man Holloway," she said. "You still seek him?" "He's dead," Elias answered. "But whatever he was chasing, others are chasing it now. Reynolds mentioned a man, Raymond Locke. I don't know what he wants, but I know his kind. Greed dressed as progress." Nehoni nodded. "Locke seeks what Holloway sought, the caves of the ancestors. My people call it the place of the breath. It is said the earth itself speaks there. The spirits guard it." Elias frowned. "And your people believe it's real?" Her gaze did not waver. "I've seen too much to doubt what cannot be explained." She paused, then added, "Holloway came to our camp months ago. He asked questions no white man should know to ask, about the sacred places, the old songs. He said he wanted to study them, to preserve our knowledge. But his eyes—" She shuddered faintly. "His eyes were hungry. He took drawings, maps, and when my father refused to guide him, he brought others. Soldiers, guns. We fled. My father stayed behind. He never returned." The fire crackled softly between them, its light flickering like memory. Elias stared into the flames, imagining the scene. Soldiers tearing through a village, fire consuming everything pure. His stomach turned. "I served under men like that," he said quietly. "They called it order. They said we were taming the wilderness. But I see now, it wasn't the land that needed taming." Nehoni's eyes glistened with reflection, not tears. "You cannot change the past," she said, but you can change how you carry it." He nodded. "And how do you carry yours?" "With both hands," she said simply. "It's heavy, but it's mine." Something in her honesty cracked him open in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent years pretending his past was a shadow that followed him. Now, hearing her, he realized it was also a compass, pointing toward something worth protecting, something worth saving. Later that night, as the fire dwindled to embers, Elias lay awake, listening to the slow, steady breathing of the two sisters. His heart felt strangely quiet, not the stillness of emptiness, but of rest. Healing, he thought, is not always a song. Sometimes it's the absence of noise. Sometimes it's the permission to sleep without nightmares. The next morning they resumed their journey, the mountains rising higher in the distance. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and rain. Kinalda seemed stronger now, smiling more, her laughter soft and rare, but bright as sunlight through storm clouds. Elias found himself watching Nehoni when she thought he wasn't looking. The way her hair moved with the wind, the strength in her posture, the calm certainty in her gaze. It was not beauty that struck him, though she was beautiful. It was the peace she carried, even in pain. By afternoon the trail grew rougher, winding through sharp rocks and narrow passes. Nehoni dismounted to walk beside the horse, her hand resting lightly on the animal's flank. "The air smells different," she said. "We're close to our people." Elias nodded, though unease tugged at him. He scanned the horizon and froze. Ahead, the canyon floor was scattered with shapes, still human shapes. They hurried forward, the sisters breaking into a run. When they reached the clearing, Elias's stomach turned to stone. Bodies lay strewn across the sand, men he recognized from the trail, bounty hunters and soldiers alike. There was no blood, no wounds, just silence. They looked as though life had been taken from them without struggle. Nehoni knelt beside one, pressing a hand to his throat. "No heartbeat," she whispered. Her voice carried reverence, not horror. "The ancestors have spoken." Elias crouched beside her, studying the scene. What could have done this? She didn't answer. And instead she stood and turned slowly, her eyes scanning the cliffs. They tried to follow Holloway. They found what he found. "What's that?" "Power," she said softly. "And the price of taking it." Kinalda moved closer, her small fingers clutching her sister's sleeve. Nehoni touched her hair gently. "It's over," she said. Though her voice carried a tremor Elias didn't miss. He felt it too. The air thick with something unseen, a force that hummed beneath the skin like a heartbeat buried deep within the earth. The desert was alive here, watching, remembering. As the sun dipped low, they buried what they could and left the rest to the wind. Elias marked the direction of the canyon walls, memorizing the patterns of the stones. "Locke will come next," he said quietly. "He won't stop until he finds whatever killed these men." "Then we must reach it first," Nehoni replied. They rode until the stars rose, their path lit by silver light. The night was quiet, but Elias felt the world shifting around them, as if the line between the living and the sacred had grown thin. When they finally stopped to rest, the air trembled with stillness. Nehoni sat beside him, her face turned toward the dark horizon. "Do you believe in spirits?" she asked. He thought for a long time before answering. "I believe in what I can't forget." She smiled faintly. "Then you already do." Her hand brushed his briefly, a small, accidental touch that lingered too long to be mistake. The warmth of it spread through him like light through the cold. He didn't move. Neither did she. The silence between them deepened, filled with everything neither dared to say. In that fragile moment, beneath the watchful stars, the haunted soldier and the woman of the desert sat side by side, two lives once divided by war, now drawn together by something neither understood but both needed. The night breathed around them, gentle, healing, endless. And as the wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the songs of the ancestors, Elias Boone realized that redemption might not be something to find in the end, but something that begins when a heart learns to listen again. The fire beside them flickered softly, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, destiny stirred, waiting to be found. The morning broke pale and quiet, as if the world itself had paused to catch its breath. Mist coiled over the canyon floor like memory, and the first sunbeams crept across the rock, painting everything in tones of honey and fire. Elias sat by the fading embers of their campfire, sharpening the edge of his knife, not because it needed sharpening, but because the motion kept his thoughts steady. Across from him, Nahoni was tending to her sister's braids, weaving small bits of turquoise thread through Kinalda's dark hair. The girl laughed softly at something her sister whispered, a laugh so clear and innocent it pierced the silence like birdsong after a storm. Elias looked up from his blade. The sound of that laughter felt like sunlight finding its way into the corners of a long-abandoned room. It reached places inside him that whiskey had never been able to touch. He wondered how long it had been since he'd truly heard joy. Years, perhaps a lifetime. Nahoni glanced at him, catching his gaze for a fleeting moment before returning to her task. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of strength and gentleness, that unsettled him in ways battle never had. He was used to danger, not tenderness. Yet around her, even silence seemed to soften. When they finished eating, they rode east toward the mountains. The air grew cooler, threaded with the scent of pine and rain. Birds traced slow arcs above them, their cries echoing off the cliffs. Each hoofbeat sounded like a heartbeat against the earth, steady, alive. Kinalda hummed again, that same wordless tune that had followed them since the ruins. Elias had stopped wondering what it meant. It was enough to feel it vibrate through the air like a prayer too old for language. By midday, the land began to rise into ridges carved by wind and time. Nahoni guided them through a narrow pass lined with ancient carvings on the stone, figures of animals, spirals and suns, messages left by hands long turned to dust. She paused to touch one of the carvings, her fingers tracing the lines reverently. "They remind us we are not the first," she murmured. Elias rode beside her. "And not the last." She turned to him with a faint smile, one that held both sorrow and peace. "If we are careful." They continued until the canyon widened, opening into a plateau where wildflowers spilled across the sand in defiance of the harshness surrounding them. It was there they saw the vultures circling in the distance. The air shifted, heavy, uneasy. Kinalda stopped humming. They found what remained of Holloway's camp at the far edge of the plateau. Books lay scattered across the ground, their pages fluttering like frightened birds. Maps torn, ink smeared. The fire pit was cold, the ashes untouched by wind, as though even nature refused to disturb what had happened here. Elias dismounted and knelt beside a bundle of papers half buried in sand. He lifted one, scanning the neat, precise handwriting. Equations, sketches of rock formations, symbols that looked half scientific, half sacred. Among them, he found a small leather-bound journal. Holloway's name was pressed faintly on the cover. Nahoni crouched beside him. "He came searching for the caves," she said quietly. "The place where the ancestors rest." "Why?" Elias asked. She looked at the horizon. "Because men like him think knowledge is something they can own. They never understand that some truths live only when left untouched." He opened the journal carefully. Inside were drawings of constellations, maps of hidden valleys, and strange notes written in both English and Apache. One page caught his attention, a sketch of a rock formation shaped like a woman's face. Beneath it, Holloway had written, "The Weeping Woman, Guardian of the Entrance." Elias closed the book, his hand trembling slightly. He found it. Nahoni nodded, her jaw tightening. "Then others will find it too." Kinalda wandered closer, picking up a torn page from the sand. She studied it with her dark, luminous eyes, then whispered a few words in Apache. The wind seemed to stir in response, swirling around them for a brief moment before falling still again. Nahoni reached for her sister's hand gently. "Do not call them yet," she said softly. "Not until we must." Elias watched them, feeling both awe and unease. The air around the sisters seemed to pulse with something unseen, a quiet energy that felt older than the rocks themselves. He had been taught to doubt such things, to name them superstition, but doubt felt small here, under a sky that had outlived every lie man had ever told himself. They buried what was left of Holloway, marking his grave with a single stone. Kinalda placed a sprig of sage beside it, her small lips moving in prayer. Elias bowed his head out of instinct. Though he didn't know the words, it didn't matter. The silence that followed felt like forgiveness shared. When they rode on, the sky began to change. Clouds gathered, their bellies bruised purple with storm. Lightning flickered in the far distance, illuminating the mountains, like the heartbeat of the earth. Nahoni glanced toward it with wary eyes. "The air is restless," she said. "Restless?" Elias asked. She nodded. "When the ancestors stir, the sky answers first." They pressed forward as the wind rose, whistling through the canyons like a hymn, both mournful and holy. Dust swirled around them, stinging their eyes, but they didn't stop. It felt as if the storm itself was urging them onward, pushing them towards something inevitable. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow canyon where the light barely touched the ground. The walls rose high on either side, covered in markings like those they had seen earlier, but more intricate, more deliberate. Kinalda dismounted suddenly, her feet moving of their own accord. "Here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias followed her gaze. At the far end of the canyon stood a rock formation shaped unmistakably like a woman's face, her eyes carved deep and sorrowful, water seeping from the cracks like tears. The Weeping Woman. Nahoni approached slowly, reverence in every step. She placed her palm against the stone's cheek, closed her eyes, and began to hum, a low, trembling sound that grew into a melody so haunting it made Elias's chest ache. The air shimmered. The stones seemed to glow faintly, the tears catching the light until they looked like silver. Then, without warning, a gunshot shattered the moment. The sound echoed through the canyon like thunder. Elias spun, pulling Nehoni down beside him. Dust exploded near their feet. Voices shouted from above. He caught sight of men, Locke's men, silhouetted on the ridge, rifles flashing in the dying light. "Run!" Elias barked, grabbing Kinalda's hand. They darted toward a cluster of rocks as bullets rained down, chipping stone, filling the air with the acrid scent of gunpowder. Nehoni fired back once, her shot echoing pure and sharp. The men scattered briefly before regrouping. "They're too many," she said, reloading. "Then we don't fight them," Elias replied. He looked toward the weeping stone, where the tears had begun to flow more freely, pooling at its base. The water shimmered unnaturally, as if reflecting not the sky, but something deeper. Kinalda stepped forward, fearless, her talisman gleaming against her chest. "Sister," she whispered, "the path is open." Nehoni hesitated, torn between faith and fear. Elias took her arm. "Trust her." The three of them ran toward the stone. The air vibrated with power now, humming like the moment before lightning strikes. The pool beneath the stone glowed brighter, blue and silver swirling together like living light. Nehoni reached it first and pressed her hand into the water. The glow rippled outward. The rock face trembled, and then split open, revealing a passage carved by no human hand. They plunged inside just as the men reached the canyon floor. Elias turned back in time to see one of them aim. The shot rang out. Pain ripped through his shoulder, white-hot, driving the air from his lungs. He stumbled forward, but Nehoni caught him, her arms strong, her eyes fierce. The stone sealed behind them, shutting out the noise, the chaos, the world. Inside, it was silent. The walls pulsed faintly with light, like the inside of some sleeping giant. Water dripped rhythmically from unseen places, echoing through the tunnels. Elias sagged against the wall, gritting his teeth. Blood soaked through his shirt. Nehoni tore a strip of cloth from her skirt, pressing it firmly against the wound. "Stay still," she whispered. Her voice trembled, not with fear but with care. Her touch was steady, warm. "You'll live." He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. She met his gaze, and for a moment the world narrowed to the space between them. The faint scent of earth and rain, the warmth of her hands, the light flickering in her eyes like the reflection of distant fire. When she finished binding the wound, she sat back, exhaustion softening her posture. Kinalda knelt beside them, her hand resting lightly on Elias's chest. The warmth of it spread through him, and for a moment he could swear the pain eased. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure to whom, to Nehoni, to the girl, or to the desert itself. They stayed there in the half-light, three souls bound by something none of them could name. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the air pulsed with the rhythm of something eternal, an ancient heartbeat that spoke not of fear, but of endurance. Elias's eyes began to close, his body surrendering to fatigue. But his last thought before sleep was not of the men who hunted them or the pain in his shoulder. It was of Nehoni's face, lit by the soft glow of the cavern, her features calm, resolute, touched by something holy. He dreamed of her standing at the mouth of the cave, the light behind her turning her into a silhouette of hope. In the dream, she reached for him, not to pull him forward, but to remind him that he was already moving toward what he had been searching for all along: forgiveness, belonging, a love that asked nothing but truth. When he woke, the air in the cavern was still and cool. The storm outside had passed. Kinalda slept nearby, curled beneath a blanket, her talisman glowing faintly. Nehoni sat a few feet away, watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice, when she spoke, was soft as water. "You rest like a man who's finally stopped running." "Maybe I have," he said. Her eyes met his, steady and bright. "Then it's time to start walking forward." Outside, the desert dawned anew, waiting. The path before them was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Elias Boone did not fear the uncertainty. The wound throbbed, but the ache felt almost alive, like proof that the heart, even after breaking, can learn to beat again. And somewhere ahead, beyond the echoes of pain and pursuit, redemption waited, patient as sunrise, quiet as love. The air within the cave felt alive, as though it breathed with them. A soft light shimmered along the walls, not from any fire or torch, but from veins of luminous stone that pulsed faintly like the heartbeat of the earth. The air smelled of rain and iron, of age and sanctity. Each drop of water that fell from the ceiling echoed like a note in a sacred song. Elias leaned against the rock, his breath still uneven, the ache in his shoulder burning, but not unbearable. He felt Nehoni's steady hands again, binding the wound tighter, her fingers sure and calm, despite the tremor that ran through the cavern floor. Kinalda stood near the center of the chamber, her talisman glowing softly, matching the rhythm of the walls. She seemed unafraid, her small face lifted toward the light, her lips moving soundlessly in a language older than their own. For a moment the air shimmered, and Elias could swear the rock itself listened. Nehoni glanced at her sister, her voice low, reverent. "She feels them," she whispered. "The ancestors. They are awake." Elias's eyes followed Kinalda's tiny silhouette, framed by light. "And what do they want?" Nehoni's gaze softened. "To see if we remember who we are." The path deeper into the cave sloped downward, winding like a serpent into the earth's heart. They walked slowly, the faint light guiding their way. The walls around them grew smooth, shaped not by tools, but by time itself. Strange symbols glowed faintly, carved into the stone. Circles within circles, hands reaching toward stars. Kinalda traced one with her fingers, then turned to Elias with a small, knowing smile. "This place," Nehoni murmured, "was where our people came when the world was born. They say the Great Spirit breathed the first wind here, and the earth answered. It is not a tomb. It is a beginning." Elias listened, his steps steady, his heart caught between wonder and unease. Every word felt like truth dressed in poetry, something he didn't understand, but deeply felt. His whole life had been a series of endings, wars, deaths, goodbyes. And yet, here, in this hollow heart of the world, he felt the whisper of beginnings again. They reached a vast chamber where the ceiling disappeared into shadow. In the center stood a stone basin filled with still, luminous water. The light within it moved slowly, like breath beneath the surface. Nehoni knelt beside it, her reflection shimmering in the glow. Kinalda joined her, dipping her fingers into the water. Ripples spread outward, and a soft sound filled the air. Not like wind or water, but like voices humming from far away, layered and endless. Elias froze. The sound grew clearer until it was not just hums, but words, not in English nor any tongue he knew, yet somehow understood. It was a song of mourning and hope, a story told without needing translation, of a people born from dust and flame, of pain and persistence, of forgiveness waiting like sunrise beyond sorrow. He felt tears prick his eyes, sudden and uninvited. He turned away, ashamed, but Nehoni saw. "It is all right," she said softly. "Even the hardest earth softens when it meets water." Her hand brushed his arm, a touch so light it barely existed, yet it burned through him more deeply than any wound. Their eyes met, hers dark and endless, his tired but open, and for a heartbeat the world around them vanished. The ancient light seemed to pulse in time with something larger than either of them. Before either could speak, the air trembled again. A faint rumble echoed through the ground. Elias instinctively reached for his gun, though he knew it would be useless against whatever this was. The luminous water began to swirl faster, glowing brighter until the entire chamber was washed in silver light. Kinalda stood motionless, eyes wide, her talisman blazing. Nehoni grabbed her sister's shoulders. "Kinalda!" But the girl's expression was calm, almost serene. "They are showing," she whispered. The light deepened, and suddenly Elias saw it. Visions painted upon the air itself, moving like reflections on the surface of water. He saw armies marching across the desert, flames consuming villages, the cries of mothers swallowed by smoke. He saw men like himself, soldiers, faces twisted with fear, obedience, confusion. And then he saw himself, standing amid that chaos, rifle in hand, watching, unable to move. He staggered back. "No." The light shifted again. Now he saw the same desert, but whole. Children laughing by the river, drums echoing through the evening air, the same people singing to the same stars. A world unbroken. The contrast tore through him like thunder. Nehoni's voice came quietly through the storm of visions. "The ancestors are not cruel," she said. "They do not show to shame, but to teach. They show what can still be healed." Elias dropped to one knee, the weight of memory pressing into him. His breath came hard, uneven. "How do you heal something like that?" She knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly over his heart. "You start where the wound began," she whispered. "You forgive what you became, and then you walk toward what you can still be." Something inside him cracked open, not breaking, but releasing. He closed his eyes, the light spilling through him until it felt like his soul itself was being washed clean. When he opened them again, the visions had faded, the water stilled. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, like the pause after a prayer. Kinalda smiled faintly, her talisman dimming. "They're done," she said softly. Elias stood slowly, his shoulder throbbing, but the pain now felt distant, unimportant. "We should go," he said. "Locke's men won't stop." Nahoni nodded. "There is another way out. The caves are alive. They shift for those who enter with purpose." They followed a narrow tunnel illuminated by faint blue veins of stone. The air grew cooler, fresher. At times, Elias thought he heard footsteps behind them, but when he turned, there was nothing. Only echoes, like the memory of footsteps long past. When they emerged into daylight again, it was near dusk. The storm had passed, leaving the desert cleansed and glowing. Clouds drifted low across the horizon, tinged with gold and lavender. The air smelled sweet, alive. For a long while they stood in silence, breathing. The world seemed softer somehow, as if it too had been touched by what lay beneath its skin. Kinalda picked a wildflower growing between the rocks and tucked it behind Nahoni's ear. The gesture was so tender, so ordinary, it felt sacred. Elias adjusted his bandage, wincing as he did. Nahoni stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "You shouldn't move so soon," she said gently. "I've been hurt worse," he replied, but his voice lacked the usual hardness. Her eyes held his. "Not like this." He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth trembling. "You're right." They camped near the mouth of the valley, a small fire burning low. The stars emerged one by one, shimmering like scattered seeds of light. Kinalda fell asleep quickly, curled beside the flames. Elias and Nahoni sat a little apart, the silence between them heavy but comforting. "The cave," he said finally. "What was it, truly?" Nahoni stared into the fire. "A mirror," she said. "It shows what we hide, so we can choose whether to keep hiding." He thought about that for a long time. "Then I saw everything I never wanted to see." "Then you were ready," she replied softly. Her voice soothed something raw inside him, like balm on a wound that had ached too long. He wanted to tell her that she had become the light in a world that once felt endless and dark, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached for the small piece of turquoise she wore around her neck. "May I?" She hesitated, then nodded. He touched the stone, feeling its smooth, cool surface, like water, like calm itself. "What does it mean?" "It means to return," she said. "Every stone that lives near the river remembers the way back to water. That's why we wear it, so we don't forget where we come from." His thumb lingered against it. "And where do I come from, Nahoni?" She looked at him, her eyes soft and deep as twilight. "From the same earth as the rest of us. You just forgot how to listen." Her words felt like grace, not judgment. For a moment he could almost believe the desert had brought him here not to punish him, but to remind him that even broken things could belong. The warmth in her gaze was more than compassion. It was understanding. The kind that didn't erase pain, but accepted it, wove it into something larger, something beautiful. The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of sage and rain. Nahoni's hair stirred, brushing against his cheek. He didn't move away. The fire crackled softly, and the world felt still enough to breathe without fear. He reached out, almost without thinking, and took her hand. It was small, strong, warm. The kind of hand that had built, healed, fought, prayed. She didn't pull away. For a while, they said nothing. Words would have broken what silence had built. Above them, the stars burned bright, 1,000 small reminders that light, no matter how distant, was still light. The desert around them seemed to sigh in contentment, a great living thing exhaling peace into the night. And in that sacred quiet, Elias Boone felt something he had not felt since he was young, the steady, unshakable knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The fire burned low, its glow fading to embers, but the warmth remained. And as sleep came for him, gentle and deep, he dreamed not of war or ghosts, but of water running clear through the canyon, washing everything clean, whispering over the stones in a voice that sounded at last like forgiveness. The dawn came softly over the desert, gilding the world in hues of pale rose and amber. The air was cool, fragrant with damp earth and wild sage after the night's rain. A thin mist clung to the low valleys, curling around stones like memory reluctant to leave. Elias woke before the others, the first warmth of the sun brushing against his skin. The ache in his shoulder had dulled, more a reminder than a wound now, as though the earth itself had drawn out the pain and replaced it with a strange, calm strength. He sat near the dying fire, running his fingers through the ash. It felt like the texture of his own past, grey, soft, weightless, yet full of what had burned. Behind him, Kinalda stirred and murmured in her sleep, her small hand clutching the talisman that never left her chest. Nehoni lay not far away, her hair fanned across the blanket like a dark river, her face turned toward the dawn. The light touched her slowly, tenderly, as if the morning itself recognized something sacred in her stillness. Elias watched her for a long moment, and for the first time in his life, the silence inside him felt whole. He thought of how many years he had lived as a shadow, chasing ghosts, drowning in guilt, mistaking movement for purpose. Yet here, in the company of two souls who had every reason to hate what he represented, he had found the one thing he had long stopped believing in, peace that asked for nothing in return. When Nehoni woke, she met his gaze and smiled faintly. It wasn't the guarded smile of gratitude or obligation. It was quiet, real, the kind that comes from two souls who have walked through fire and found each other on the other side. They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, the gold deepening into the red of the canyon walls. The journey north continued, winding through narrow ravines where echoes trailed behind them like forgotten songs. The wind whispered through the stones, carrying scents of cedar and rain. Sometimes Kinalda would sing under her breath, a melody without words, and the air seemed to glow around her. By midday, they reached higher ground. From the ridge, Elias saw the land unfold before them, valleys rippling with green from the recent storms, the faint glimmer of a river far off, and beyond it the distant outline of mesas, ancient and unmoving. "It's beautiful," he murmured. Nehoni nodded. "That valley is safe. My people once lived there before the raids began. The soil still remembers them." They descended slowly, following a path marked by small cairns of stacked stones. Each marker seemed to hum faintly when the wind passed, as though carrying messages from the ones who had built them long ago. As they walked, Nehoni spoke in fragments, stories of her father's wisdom, her mother's laughter, the way the tribe used to gather by the river at dusk to dance and pray. Each word painted a life Elias could almost see, a life the world had stolen, but that still lived through her voice. He listened without interrupting, and the more he listened, the more he realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but learning how to let it breathe without pain. Every step, every breath beside her felt like prayer, wordless, quiet, alive. By evening, they reached the valley's edge. The river shimmered in the last light, bending like silver glass between the hills. There were signs of life, smoke rising from a far campfire, the faint laughter of children carried on the wind. Nihoni slowed, her hand tightening on her sister's. "Our people," she whispered. Elias followed her gaze. Figures emerged in the distance, men and women stepping out from tents, pausing as they saw the travelers approaching. A tall man came forward, grey braids streaked with silver, his eyes sharp but kind. He spoke in Apache, his tone both wary and warm. Nihoni answered with a rush of emotion, tears gathering in her eyes. When the man smiled and opened his arms, she ran to him, Kinalda following with a cry of joy. Elias stood a few paces behind, unsure whether to move closer. He watched as the sisters were embraced, surrounded by welcoming hands, murmured prayers, soft laughter. It was a reunion he did not belong to, and yet he could not look away. There was something deeply healing in watching love that had survived so much loss still find its way home. When Nihoni finally turned toward him, she gestured for him to come. The people stepped aside as he approached. Their eyes studied him with quiet curiosity. The rifle at his side, the pale scar on his jaw, the weight of an old soldier's guilt that even the desert couldn't wash away. Nihoni spoke to the elder, who listened, his gaze steady on Elias. When she finished, the old man stepped closer. "You have walked with our blood," he said in careful English. "That makes you part of the story now." Elias bowed his head. "I came here to protect them. I didn't expect—" His voice broke off. "To be forgiven?" the elder asked gently. Elias nodded. The old man smiled faintly. "Forgiveness is not a gift from us. It is something you must give yourself. But you are welcome here, if your heart means what your words say." It was a simple acceptance, but it struck Elias harder than any sermon. The tightness in his chest loosened, and for the first time in years his breath came easy. That night the tribe celebrated quietly. They sang old songs, voices blending into the rhythm of drums that pulsed like the heartbeat of the land. The stars spilled across the sky in an ocean of silver. Nihoni sat beside him near the fire, her face aglow with light and peace. Kinalda danced with the other children, her laughter rising above the music. Elias felt something inside him shift. Not a sudden revelation, but a gentle turning, like the earth adjusting toward dawn. When Nihoni's hand brushed his, he didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm, her touch deliberate, grounding. She looked at him, her eyes shining with the reflection of firelight. "You can stay," she said softly, "if you wish. There's land here, work to be done, and a place for those who choose peace." He wanted to say yes, but fear flickered through him. Fear of not belonging, of failing again, of being the shadow in someone else's light. She must have sensed it, because she leaned closer and whispered, "The past doesn't need to be carried like a stone. Sometimes you can lay it down and let it become part of the ground that holds you." Her words sank deep. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not just a woman, but a bridge between everything he had been and everything he could still become. The fire cracked softly, and the sound felt like a heartbeat steadying. When the songs faded and the stars deepened, they walked together beyond the circle of light to the edge of the river. The water glowed faintly under the moon, reflecting the constellations in broken ripples. Nihoni knelt and touched the surface, murmuring words Elias didn't understand. Then she turned to him. "In our tradition," she said, "water carries stories. You speak your sorrow to it, and it carries it away. Will you try?" He hesitated, then knelt beside her. The cool water lapped at his fingers. "I don't know what to say." "Then just breathe," she said. "The river will know." He closed his eyes and exhaled, the sound trembling with everything he hadn't let himself feel. He thought of the faces from the past, the pain, the guilt, the endless wandering. He thought of how it all led here, to this moment, this woman, this quiet valley where even the ghosts seemed to rest. When he opened his eyes, the current had carried away the ripples. The water was calm again, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. Nihoni smiled, her expression soft, luminous. "See, even the earth forgives." He turned to her, and something wordless passed between them. Not desire, not confession, but a recognition that went deeper than either. He reached for her hand again, and this time she laced her fingers through his. The air between them shimmered with a tenderness that felt older than time. They sat there until the moon climbed high, its light silvering the world. The night was filled with the sounds of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the steady breath of the river. Every sound felt like part of a larger harmony. When Nihoni leaned her head against his shoulder, he closed his eyes. The weight of her resting there was light, but grounding, like the touch of grace. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some moments heal not through words, but through the quiet proof that you are no longer alone. As the night stretched deeper, he thought of all the roads he'd ridden, all the places he'd searched for meaning. None of them had led him to peace, and yet here, beside her, in this hidden valley wrapped in moonlight, he finally understood that redemption was never about escaping pain. It was about transforming it into love. When morning came, the village stirred to life. Children's laughter echoed, smoke rose from fires, and the first rays of light caught on the river like gold. Elias helped mend a fence with 2 young men, his muscles steady, his heart lighter. Nihoni prepared food for the day's journey ahead, her hands graceful and strong. The rhythm of life moved around them like music, quiet but enduring. That evening, when the work was done, Elias stood at the edge of the camp, looking toward the horizon. He knew Locke would not stop searching, that darkness still lingered in the world beyond this valley. But he also knew that some light, once kindled, could not be extinguished. Nihoni joined him, her eyes following his gaze. "There will always be storms," she said, "but you don't have to walk through them alone." He turned to her, his heart steady, his voice quiet. "I'm not alone anymore." The wind stirred her hair, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke. For a moment, everything around them glowed. The river, the stars, even the air. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. And in that stillness, beneath a sky wide enough to hold every sorrow and every hope, Elias Boone understood that the road to redemption did not end here. It began here, in the shared silence of love, in the forgiveness born from understanding, in the simple, sacred act of staying when once he would have fled. The river flowed beside them, endless, eternal, whispering softly of healing, of peace, of the quiet promise that life, no matter how broken, could still be beautiful again. The years moved like gentle rivers through the valley, carrying away the weight of what once was and replacing it with quiet life. Seasons came and went, each one writing its own small miracle upon the land. The desert that had once been a place of exile became a garden of belonging. Wildflowers grew where ashes had fallen. The sound of laughter replaced the echo of gunfire, and beneath the vast, unending sky, Elias Boone learned what it meant to live again. He built his home by the river's bend, where the earth was soft and the water sang through every hour of the day. The house was simple: stone walls, cedar beams, a roof woven with straw and clay. Yet to him it felt grander than any mansion men could build. Nehoni filled it with warmth: woven blankets, baskets of herbs, the scent of sage and smoke and rain. Kinalda's laughter filled every room. The nights that had once haunted him now passed in peace, each breath an unspoken prayer of gratitude. Sometimes he would wake before dawn, step outside, and watch the mist rise from the river like breath from the earth itself. The valley was alive in those hours: birds stirring, coyotes calling from distant ridges, the faint hum of life beginning anew. He would close his eyes and feel it, that deep, quiet harmony, and it would steady him in ways words never could. He no longer reached for the bottle. He reached for stillness, for truth, for her. Nehoni worked beside him through the years, her hands as sure in healing as they were in building. She taught him to plant by the rhythm of the moon, to read the language of the wind, to give thanks for what the soil returned. When the rains came, she would stand barefoot beneath them, face lifted to the sky, arms open as if welcoming every drop as a gift. He would watch her, always in awe, realizing that some souls are born not just to survive the storm, but to teach others how to dance in it. At night they would sit together beneath the stars, the world hushed but full, the kind of silence that heals rather than hurts. Sometimes she would hum the same melody Kinalda once sang, the song that had carried them through the desert. And Elias, who had forgotten the language of prayer, found himself whispering thanks to a God he could no longer name, because maybe names didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was the light in her eyes when she looked at him, or the sound of the river flowing steady beside their home. Kinalda grew tall, her spirit bright and fierce like her sister's. She learned the stories of her people and the language of the white settlers, bridging the two worlds with grace. The valley became a refuge, a place where Apache and ranchers traded not in violence, but in peace. Elias worked tirelessly to keep it so. He rode to nearby towns, stood before men who saw only divisions of color and creed, and spoke quietly of what he had seen, what he had learned. That redemption was not a tale told in churches or courts, but in the way people chose to treat one another when no one else was watching. Some listened, others didn't. But the seeds he planted took root slowly, stubbornly, like wildflowers between stones. One evening, years later, he found himself standing where the weeping woman's tears once fell. The canyon was quiet now, its stones covered with moss, the pools clear and shallow. He placed his hand upon the rock, feeling the faint vibration beneath it, the pulse of something eternal. The tears had never stopped, but they were no longer mournful. They sounded like rain on spring leaves, like blessing. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." When he turned, Nahoni was there, her shawl fluttering in the wind, her smile soft with understanding. She didn't ask what he had said. She didn't need to. She stepped close, pressing her forehead to his chest, her breath steady, her presence grounding him in the moment. Together, they stood there, listening to the water, the sound of the world remembering itself. That night, back in the valley, the sky burned with stars. The air was warm and still, the scent of mesquite heavy and sweet. A gathering had formed by the riverbank. Laughter, singing, the beating of drums that carried through the dark. Children danced, their bare feet kicking up sparks of dust that glowed in the firelight. Kinalda, now a young woman, led them with joy that shone like sunrise. Elias sat beside Nahoni, his hand in hers. "Do you ever think," he asked quietly, "that everything broken can be made whole again?" Nahoni smiled, her eyes reflecting the fire. "Not everything," she said, "but everything can be loved again. And love makes even the broken things beautiful." Her words lingered between them, tender and true. He turned to her, tracing the curve of her jaw with his thumb, marveling at the miracle of her, this woman who had walked beside him through fear, through faith, through forgiveness. He kissed her then, not as a man claiming something, but as one returning home. The firelight flickered over them, and for a moment the world seemed to hold still, time bending in reverence to the simple grace of two hearts that had found peace in each other. When the drums faded and the river's song softened into the hum of night, Elias walked alone for a while, letting the quiet wrap around him. He thought of all the men he had buried, all the pain he had carried, and how each sorrow had somehow led him here. He thought of the ghosts that had once haunted him, and realized they no longer followed. They rested now, somewhere in the light. He came to the edge of the water and looked up at the stars. They shimmered in patterns he had once seen carved into the walls of the sacred cave, hands reaching toward the heavens, circles within circles. A thought came to him then, gentle as breath. Maybe the heavens had always mirrored the human heart, broken in places, beautiful in others, always shining, always whole. When he returned to their home, Nahoni was waiting by the doorway. She reached out her hand, and he took it. Inside, the fire still glowed low, casting golden light upon the walls. He felt her warmth beside him, the scent of her hair like cedar and earth, the rhythm of her breath blending with his. Outside, the desert slept, quiet and eternal, as though the universe itself had finally found rest. Years later, when people spoke of Elias Boone, they did not speak of the soldier or the bounty hunter, but of the man who built a bridge between two worlds. They spoke of the valley he helped protect, the peace that endured long after his footsteps faded. Some said he was buried beside the river, where the first light touches the water each morning. Others said his spirit still rode with the wind, guarding the land that had healed him. But those who knew him, those who remembered his eyes, steady and kind, said only this: he found home. And perhaps that was all that ever mattered. The valley endured. The river kept singing. Wild flowers bloomed each spring. Children grew. Old stories were told anew, and the wind carried Nihoni's songs across the hills. The world changed, as it always does, but the peace they built lingered like fragrance in the air, a promise that love could outlast even history. And somewhere, if you listened closely, you could still hear his voice, steady, warm, carried through the wind. The world is never beyond mending. Even the desert learns to bloom again. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love can heal what time once broke, let your voice join the song. Like this tale, leave your thoughts, share what you felt, and subscribe to walk with us through more journeys of hope, forgiveness, and faith. Your presence here keeps these stories alive, glowing like firelight in the dark. Every comment, every spark of kindness helps the next soul find its way home.